all birds are bound by that rule, and so a bird can't necessarily do backflips to its leisure because it has predators that can find it, or it's spending energy, and if it's spending energy it must get energy in return. It's very hard to stay what we might call calorie positive in a primitive or survival situation. Believe me, I've been trying it. This is actually the first time I've been indoors in about 6 months, 8 months. So really trying to give it a go as to living survival and foraging practice is definitely not easy. It's definitely not as romantic as they show you on television, so be mindful of that. Now has been the Acorn Harvest, so a lot of people are out there, including myself, running around gathering acorns, trying to stash up for the winter. I feel like basically a squirrel. So it takes a lot of processing. And one of the things I realized in that processing is actually I could either be the gatherer of the acorns, and which means basically hand selecting, finding all the acorns, and then you have to figure out how to dry them. So then the role switches, and in that moment you're now the acorn dryer and storer. And yet as you're doing that, and it takes hours and hours, and luckily my assistant and I, Lauren, thank you Lauren, was helping me pick out all the little bits of shell from 30-40 pounds of acorns. So it took a lot of energy, and I realized at that time, since I had to be drying the acorns or else it would all mold on me, that's all the time when I could be gathering more. So there's obviously two tribes, two groups that will occur, and some of them will be gathering and bringing them back to the people sitting around the fire, and then those people will be processing them. And yes, they can switch and all that, and yet it's really interesting to see how in a group setting survival or foraging really changes quite drastically, and that's what it's going to take, say, in the future if we want to come together and sort of build a more sustainable or rewilding or neo-aboriginal or paleolithic sort of culture. We need, again, the sense of community in a deeper way than anything we in the West have seen in our lives since probably before World War II. So with that said, as you may have not heard, some new people joined. There is an ability on the Ustream page to go to chat. So you just hit the menu and then you hit chat, and at any time you feel free to ask any questions. So we'll get started with some of the questions. Let's see here. So good old Olga, wonderful friend with Onco Earth Arts, and she just actually got registered as a nonprofit in New Jersey, so we're really excited about that because that's going to open up a lot of nature teaching capacity, yoga, all kinds of things for kids and adults, thanks to Olga's really profoundly magical help. Also, Olga is credited for helping me to figure out how to get through the Facebook drama when Facebook took my account. And then I made another one under the name Dandelion because I figured, what the hell, it's time for a transformation. And within that one first day, they kicked me off again and said, you have to prove that you're Dandelion. So what I did from there was Olga and I were talking for 2-3 months, and we figured out how to kind of get around that drama. So if you're interested in keeping your name as it is and not getting harassed by the man, you can just go to my first post on the Dandelion Facebook page, and there I shared about that. So she's saying, basically, she's curious about Western herbalism history, the tradition and the culture. She's saying how we hear a lot about Chinese medicine and Ayurvedic culture, but we don't really hear as much about the local and native practices of North America. This is because we got here, and basically European herbalists came here, and they were already sort of indoctrinated into a belief system that generally said that faith healing through Jesus is more powerful than herbalism, and that herbalism is essentially witchcraft. So when native people were here, that's the birth of the dichotomy between native indigenous herbalism being the platform for which our culture rose out of versus a huge disconnection. So oftentimes we look, as a culture, we look to Ayurveda, we look to China, we look to India, we look to all these traditions, South America, we look to all these traditions which have less oppressed herbal traditions so that we can piece together the pieces. A lot of things are lost in that, and one of the things that are lost in that, which I'm a big proponent of, is actually cross-comparing genus of plants which are maybe famous in India and not really known here. So one of the greatest examples is this plant Salves, which is called Oriental Bittersweet. And very interestingly enough, if you look at the genus of Salves, the Oriental Bittersweet, that is what it is. There's an Ayurvedic herb called Jadamamsi, which actually is also a Salves. So are they cross-comparable in medicinal composition? It's very hard to tell, and hopefully if I keep ranting and raving about that fact, we can get more people to do some kind of chemical analysis with that, because it's very easy to understand. A college student in a couple hours with a chemical laboratory can do that work. The question is, why hasn't that been done? Obviously, you probably all know the answer. Herbalism is not very popular in America right now, but very much changing. So actually, one of the great things I was able to do is kind of live in the Pine Barrens for a couple weeks and really learned how special the Pine Barrens are. Within that experience, as I was harvesting tons and tons of blueberries with Katya, we just went crazy harvesting and eating blueberries. And within that experience, I learned about, let's see this guy's name, Dr. Still, who was a black slave, and he learned from the Native Americans. And he eventually became freed, and he became known as the Pine Barrens physician. So a really cool part of the story is that there are all these people who slip through the cracks, and don't forget, pharmaceutical medicine is not that old. So we do have a lot of people, black slaves as well as native people, who made their way through the cracks. However, the problem is the traditions have been beaten and there are gaps everywhere. So as a forager, as an herbalist, one of the great things and one of the most exciting aspects of this tradition is, like I'm saying, is that Salves relatable, so that we wouldn't have to necessarily buy it from India. And this is known as an invasive plant, which is here, which no one knows what to do with. And yet, imagine if it could be a local Jadamamsi, which has a whole tradition and history behind it. So there's a lot of keys that we have to unlock within this tradition, which basically native people would have known. So, there's a lot about Western herbalism. I mean, the more modern Western herbalism, I'm forgetting that book, Back to Nature, right? So, Klaus, I believe, is his last name, and that really seemed to have started the tradition from Rosemary Gladstar to Susan Weed to all these kind of really base generational herbalists who basically were the first ones in a very long time to say, hey, did you know that you can eat some things in your backyard? Of course, Yule Gibbons, David Winston was in that. There's a lot of wonderful people who kind of preserve that tradition. Wildman Steve Brill. All these people got in between basically the death of the idea that anything on your lawn is something other than something to mow. So really interesting to kind of explore these Western herbal traditions, and basically it goes right back down to Native American herbalism. And unfortunately, just like everywhere in the indigenous world, you have that modernization is starting to really promise, has always been promising this betterment, or your life will be better if you modernize. So unfortunately, a lot of the old generation herbalists, foragers, medicine people have a big disconnection with their grandchildren who maybe want to play video games and, I don't know, be a nuclear physicist instead of a traditional herbalist. So we can't fault them at that, but I feel like you are the ones who will actually bridge that gap between those indigenous people who are now old and maybe will be leaving the planet soon, preserving this knowledge. And this is very much what happened in, basically, as we came out of the idea of oppressing the native culture, there were a few people, anthropologists, who came and they started trying to understand the herbal traditions. However, there's several factors. One, they had serious biases and they were trained with a certain hierarchical perception. So whatever was said was filtered through that cultural paradigm that they lived in. The other factor is that sometimes the native people probably kept secrets and sometimes maybe even lied. So you know, this is stuff written down. Those are the kind of factors that really hurt the tradition, and yet we can't blame this, but we need to really gain the trust of indigenous people to get this knowledge, to try to preserve this, because it's going to be extremely helpful. So, of course, long-winded answer from Dandelion. Are you shocked? So Katya says, I like to mix a lot of herbs when I'm making teas. Most of the time I'm just going with what feels right. Are there any herbal mixes that potentially can be dangerous for your health? Is there any rules of thumb? So, I mean, without understanding which herbs are being worked with to make a formula, which is something interesting because as an herbalist, people don't really understand that. Herbalism is not Googling 5 different herbs and putting them together and trying to heal ourselves. Herbalism is much more about understanding herbal actions. If you want to know more about that, you can Google that. Diuretic, alterative, styptic, you know, all these terms that you hear, these are herbal actions, and they're due to chemical compounds. And so what an herbalist will do is look at the larger spectrum of, well, I need this condition, I need to do this, this, and this. There are this herbs in combination to do that. So formulation is a whole different level. When you're making your own teas, generally, usually you're not getting sort of a heroic dose, let's say, of herbalism through tea. So it would be different in a tincture or eating a powder or something. And also, generally, the herbs sold in the stores and the herbs that are available are really not going to be very dangerous. There is something called low-dose herbs, which are things like pokeweed, lobelia. Those are the only 2 I can think of right now. Those don't want to be made into tea. So if you added pokeweed root with any tea, that would be a problem. So as long as you're avoiding low-dose herbs, then really the other things to think about are basically what we can call mood-altering herbs, such as St. John's wort. St. John's wort has some issues definitely with, you know, people who are taking pharmaceuticals. There's a big problem there. So generally the contraindications of herbalism are not about, you know, can fennel go with ginger, or can peppermint go with chamomile, or can slippery elm be put with gotu kola. That all usually is generally very fine, and especially if you're making a tea out of it and not going to use essential oils, for example, which can have worse negative effects. So if you're making teas, generally you're pretty safe as long as you have the right correct herb, correctly identified herb, and it tastes good. And you're not using low-dose herbs or anything that really is conflicting with other pharmaceuticals. As I mentioned to students a lot of times, pharmaceuticals are very jealous against herbs, but herbs are generally not very jealous against each other, despite those few factors. So Amanda Carson says, I've heard wintergreen is poisonous. I just harvested a bunch, including the berries. Is this true, and or how do you use it? So I do have a video on my YouTube channel, which is Return to Nature Skills, and there I help you correctly identify wintergreen. This is the #1 thing. I also had someone say on that video, well, wintergreen is not tea berry. These are 2 common names. And I really helped me to express to him, and also now to you, that when you're dealing with common names, it's very important to just do a quick Google search to try to see what that plant is known for. So fireweed, as a common name, for example, has about 4 or 5 different plants, even in North America, called fireweed. They're not all going to be the same. So when you're saying I've heard wintergreen is poisonous, if you're talking about, let's see, Gaultheria, wintergreen, this is the great thing about doing this on a computer, huh? I can look up anything. Here we go. So we have wintergreen, commonly known as Gaultheria. There are several of them. That one is completely non-toxic. There's no issues with that. Wintergreen oil, whenever you make an essential oil, that can have more toxicity issues. But if you're talking about the leaf and the berry, you could not eat enough of them to have any issues, unless, of course, as I mentioned, you're taking pharmaceuticals, which might have some interaction. The other one is known as spotted wintergreen, so chemophilia, maculata, something like that, and those are different. They're in the same family, but they're very different herbs. So spotted wintergreen is not as commonly understood or known, although it is astringent to the taste, so if you did nibble it, it would have an astringent taste, and that indicates some of its medicinal value. But wintergreen has that really beautiful wintergreen flavor, right? That's where the wintergreen flavor comes from. So if you take the wintergreen leaf and you smell it, it should smell like wintergreen. And if it does not, it's not the right plant. So the question really further is, when someone says, you know, is wintergreen poisonous? Which plant do you mean? Because oftentimes I don't know if you actually know how to identify that plant, so you could have anything. A common, somewhat similar look-alike to wintergreen is when rhododendron are very young. They have somewhat similar leaves and grow in the same habitat, but rhododendron are generally more oblong, so they're going to be longer, like banana shape almost, or wintergreen is more circular. So, you know, if you crush the leaf and you smell it, it should really smell potently like wintergreen with no question. There is no poisonous aspects to it, and generally this should be fine to use. You could actually send a picture on my Facebook, and then I can help just to verify that you have the wintergreen. And as I mentioned, check out that video. So Nick Gabriel, hello friend. He wants to know more about working with birch as well as sassafras. So he's saying, I'm definitely curious about root teas and other uses. So root tea is the time now. So this is the time where all the leaves are dropping off and the roots are going into their dormancy. That's where all the potency goes. When, as an herbalist, as a forager, you have to think seasonally, where is the medicine going? Where is the medicine going? So when spring comes, the energy rises into creating flowers, and those flowers want to be pollinated, and those pollinated flowers make seeds for the next generation, right? When the fall comes, all of that starts to die, and those which are called annuals are finished, but they've already gotten their seeds, so they'll drop for next year. Those which are biennials are now going dormant, and they haven't made seeds. They've just worked on leaves for the first season. Now they're going into the fall, their leaves get much smaller, and they really put all that energy, all that photosynthesis they've done, all their solar charging, they put that back into their roots. Then next spring they come out, and then they'll produce a stalk, and that stalk will produce seeds, right, with flowers. So this is burdock. Anything in the aster generally is a biennial, right, versus basil and the mint families are annuals, so they die every year, most of them. Sure, there are always exceptions with the plants. The other aspect to that is perennial, which means goes to root all the time. So a tree is like perennial. So when we're dealing with sassafras, we can look at, or birch, we can look at the fact that the medicine is going from the leaves of sassafras, right, and then the leaves are dropping in the fall and it's going back into the roots. So you want to follow that cycle. Yes, you can still harvest a root in the summer. It's not going to be as potent, and yet anything is better than nothing if you're dealing with, you know, finding your own healing. So with sassafras, the roots are, this actually, that doctor I was talking about in the Pine Barrens, his documentation is like, well, I dug sassafras and did this and did this. Basically he worked with it a lot. We know that indigenous people worked with sassafras for syphilis. We know that lime is connected to syphilis, right? It is a spirochete. So sassafras has a profound tradition as an antibacterial and antiviral. It is also an anti-inflammatory. There was some problems with sassafras where some company decided to do a botched test, and they extracted saffrol from it, and this is an isolated ingredient, not a plant. And so then they injected it into rats, and the rats got cancer, therefore they banished saffrol. Even worse, they banished sassafras. So that's like implying, if I took hydrogen from water and injected it into your veins until you died, I would then extrapolate that water killed people. So it's a very interesting thing. Generally with the plant body as it is, without doing some sort of I'm smarter than the plant extraction, if you're making a tea right? You're gonna fill up on sassafras and be like, I can't drink any more tea, and your body will do something called urinate. That gets it out of your system. So generally you're not going to be able to hit lethal doses, especially not as you would with a pharmaceutical extract of saffrol. So there is this carcinogenic warning on several plants, and that just needs to be carefully looked at and carefully scrutinized. Who paid for those studies? What's going on there? Questions like that, using your old consciousness to understand what's going on here. With that said, sassafras is one of those plants that deer are eating. It's a common understory plant, and it grows runners. So you'll have a lot of saplings like this underground. Here's your underground. So this sapling is going to be connected to that other one. You can kill a lot of plants by harvesting sassafras roots, so it's not recommended to take a lot unless there's a huge abundance in a certain area. If you do harvest sassafras, one root does make several cups of tea. So if you find a sapling and you can actually figure out how to trace between that, that's a very important thing, and you can actually replant some of the saplings. I've done that with some success. Not always, but you have to be very careful at your harvest of roots. Roots are killing the plant, just consider. The other thing is wintergreen. Birch, which is, there's white birch, there's silver birch, there's paper bark birch, and there's black birch. Around here in the Northeast we have a lot of black birch. That's the one that also shares this wintergreen flavor. So these are again the 4 extracts that really started the pharmaceutical industry, which are these anti-inflammatories. One of them was from birch, one of them was from meadowsweet, one of them was from wintergreen, and one of them was from, oh, what was it? I don't remember, but you can see that. So black birch twigs are one of my favorite teas, one of my favorite medicinals. However, it's very interesting because as soon as they dry, they don't have the same potency. So it's very important to harvest black birch twigs young and use them as you have them instead of drying them out. One of the great things about black birch that you can also do is you can make an infused oil. This puts them in an oil. You take the birch twigs, you break them up as small as you can, put them in an oil, olive oil, jojoba oil. Coconut oil gets solid, so consider you can probably pull it off in the summer. So you'd shake that up every couple of days, and within a month you have what's called infused oil, birch infused oil. That is great topically for any sort of pain, any sort of inflammatory issues. Any issue where there is inflammation to the body, birch oil is wonderful for. As we mentioned, it's an anti-inflammatory, so creaky joints, aches, pains. So that's basically a little bit about those two. This is the time of roots. This is the time of the earth, the plants going into the earth, and so we want to focus on that level of harvest. So Michael Albin says, I have a question about using aloe in salves. Have I ever had experience adding aloe in salves? If so, what's the right process? So a salve or a salve, depending, it's spelled salve, but those good old Western herbalists such as rosemary and others say salve. So it is therefore a salve. That's basically a topical ointment of sorts, and you put it in a little jar, and generally, here we go, ta-da, organic herbal salve. Return to nature herbal salve. So, this is basically a chapstick or a balm. You can put it on your lips, you can put it on your skin, anything like that. And what you make that out of determines sort of some of the uses. So, for example, looking at herbal actions, you may want to pull something, extract something. You may want to add something in. So pulling is maybe for mosquito bites, bug bites, things like that, right? Where adding something in is like a plant high in minerals that you can put into a salve that would maybe go into an injury to help it heal, such as comfrey. So we have some of those, basically 2 basic actions. Now a salve is basically some part oils and some part beeswax to harden it. Otherwise you'd have what's called an infused oil. Right, so you take so you can take actually some of that infused oil, say we had birch, and we can add that into a salve, and we can add some beeswax to harden it, because carrying this around in as a birch oil, you put that in your pocket, it's a hot day, it's going to get all over the place. If you add a certain amount of beeswax, it hardens it off, it helps it be more stable. Generally, the basic recipe of salves is 2 parts oil to 1 part beeswax. I've done stuff where I've made 3 parts oil to 1 part beeswax. It really depends on how hard you want it to be. One of the greatest tricks I've learned, this is from James Green's book, The Herbal Medicine Maker's Handbook, big, fat, great, wonderful book, highly recommend it. He recommends to, also my herbalist, my teachers, Chris and Tammy at Hearthstone Herb School, also taught me this, which is that when your formula is there, when you think you have the salve as you'd like it, put a spoon into it, put that spoon in the freezer for a couple minutes, take it out, and see the consistency. The consistency will basically tell you how it's going to be once the salve dries, because it's a pain in the butt to pour off all these salves, let it harden, the next day you come back and it's hard as a rock, right? Or it's too soft and mushy. So having your ratio of salve is very important. 2 parts oil to 1 part beeswax, let's just say, gives you the ability of using any oil in a 2 to 1 ratio. So you can use some birch oil, you can use olive oil, you can use jojoba oil, you can use all of these kind of things to supplement that in. With aloe vera, I've tried a couple times to put aloe vera in a salve, and basically it stays liquid. So I have not succeeded in making aloe vera salve. Since you asked the question, I did look online, and there seems to be no real recipe that I could find. So if anybody out there knows how to make an aloe vera salve which doesn't separate when it hardens, you let me know. Just a little bit about salve making, which could be a whole class in itself. You take basically a pot, you fill it with water, you put a ball jar like that, and you'll put your beeswax first, right? You measure everything out, you put your beeswax first, you heat that, you boil it. This is called double boiling. You'll heat that until the wax melts, then you'll add however much of your infused oils or any oil that you have, and then last, if you're going to add essential oils, because they're volatile and they'll evaporate if you add them early. You don't want to heat treat them. So you'd put that in, you'd make it stirred up, and then last you pour it out into your jars, right? So you can use any kind of jar, and then just make sure you do the spoon test first, because you don't want to fill up 35 jars to learn that it's too hard and you don't like the consistency. So that's basically salve making 101. Breyer asks, what's my view on invasive plants? Is it really damaging the ecosystem to crowd out native plants, or are there plants here to heal the land, or something in between? I would say we're culturally moving from either or to yes and. So are some of the new plants that have gotten into this continent crowding out some of the plants that were here? Definitely. However, if you look culturally, hasn't the same thing happened? Like, we're not supposed to be here, essentially. I mean, we have poor treaties with Native Americans. We've taken over lots of their land and put them on reservations. So when we look back and go, oh my God, the forest is not Native American anymore, well, neither is the culture. And so we have to try to resolve that there is 2 dimensions to that issue. One of them is a physical issue and a habitat and ecosystem issue. The other one is a cultural perceptual issue. That one is harder to address. People don't want to hear anything about that generally. Yes, we can rip up invasive plants and try to hope that those native plants will be restored. However, some new invasive plants will just come in and probably take that niche. What I recommend is very simple. If we want to rip out the invasive plants, the known as invasive plants, I put that in quotes because the idea of invader is a human idea. Okay? If anything is invasive, it's human greed, concrete, what we're doing, pollution in the ecosystem. That is going to cause much more ecological damage to put pollution in the ecosystem than, say, Japanese knotweed. I guarantee it. Along with this is Timothy Scott wrote a book called Invasive Plant Medicine, which details lots and lots of research and shows all the money that is spent on spraying Roundup on invasive plants. Now, I guarantee you, long-term studies will show that Roundup spraying is going to be much more damaging than any plant that comes into the ecosystem as far as What is the qualification and classification? Biodiversity. Okay, that's the real issue. So if biodiversity is a problem, lawns are some of the most invasive thing. Monocultures are some of the most invasive issues. So there is two sides to this conversation, and I feel like it can be had maturely, and I see that maybe what we can do is actually use the internet as a forum to discuss these things with the best of everyone coming together, calmly discussing what to do about invasive plants. Okay, my suggestion is that imagine that Gaia, the ecosystem, brought forth a solution in our foolishness, that we actually are in Eden, that the ecosystem is saying, let me provide you food and medicine, and we're just saying, get rid of this, get rid of this. I want my medicine and food to come from where? Big pharma, big agriculture. So what's more invasive on a holistic perspective is a very different question than what is happening in this microcosmic part of the ecosystem. Along with that said, we have seen that there are a lack of actually 100-year studies or 200 or 500-year studies about what happens. So basically Timothy Scott in his book recommends there are these studies. I don't know them offhand, but they're in his book. And Japanese knotweed seems to have come into the area, grown deep tap roots, broken up very hard packed soil, and then has reduced, and other things have come in kind of as a keystone. Could that be the ecosystem's intentionality? Could that be a Gaian process that is millions of years old? Definitely. Is there a potential that the ecosystem knows how to switch and shift plants around to perform certain functions consciously? That's totally possible. Okay, so we have to really look at, we don't know how the ecosystem works. This is a 6 billion year old planet. Okay, that's incredible. So we don't know, okay, and that's the hardest part. 6 billion year old universe, right? I don't even know how old the planet is per se. So we have a huge issue with that, but my recommendation is, why don't we harvest instead of weed, right? Why don't we take those and build an actual economy out of them, starting from a small scale? So if autumn olives are a problem and everyone wants to complain about autumn olives, well, we should have no fruit roll-ups, we should have no chemical foods, we should have no berries coming in from China. Let's all then provide ourselves the local infrastructure to a cottage industry. Yes, radical idea, right? It's so simple. So do we need to create more monocultures across global capitalism to provide ourselves the food that we need? And this is what I try to bring up to anyone who's chasing away invasive plants. What is your alternative? What are you eating otherwise? And I think it's very important to realize that large-scale agriculture is not the solution either. And so what if we then ate our way out of the problem? That's all. I'll rant about that. But one of the other things I'm doing right now is doing a lot of writing on book, making a book, basically either calling it the Yoga of Ecology or Cultural Symbiosis. And I'm talking a lot about how the banished from Eden myth is really a factor in this issue of invasive plants. And basically we got kicked out of Eden because we ate the forbidden fruit. So it's very interesting. Along with that, I think there's a sort of guilt that comes along with this issue, such as that people who are trying to restore the ecosystem to what it once was, that's like saying there's a very small picture and we want to get back to that picture. But if that's true, then volcanoes and mastodons were right here, right, spewing off. So what is that snapshot that you want to create to say, let's get it back to this point? Because trees used to be invasive. I mean, oxygen-bearing bacteria were invasive to anaerobic bacteria. So we have a whole cultural trend, right, of something replacing an old thing. And we can't stay in the past. It's impossible. So, let's see what else. That's basically all the questions so far. Let's see if anyone else has posted any questions. You got anything, people out there? So I'll be actually writing in the next few days. I'll post some of the writing that I've been working on, and it will be about the banished from Eden complex, sense perception, and the return to nature. looking at sort of how do we get a new cultural paradigm in place that's not us versus nature, or nature has to be fixed with our own efforts, or we're here to fix or perfect nature, but what is actually the ecosystem broadcasting? This is something very important that we're here to look at. It's very likely that the ecosystem is actually cleaning itself. That's totally possible. We're looking at some of the bioremediation aspects of plants, and we don't know, they don't know enough about bioremediation to say anything about what the ecosystem is doing. That's just frankly the point. Someone asks, what are my thoughts on cannabis? Very interesting. I feel like cannabis can be a medicine, and it's not always a medicine. And the difference is you, and how you work with it, and where it comes from. So, a little quick thought on that. Within that, I wanted to just explore, a lot of people ask me about fermentation all the time. I have some articles on my website. I also have a YouTube video from the NOFA conference that I did on vegetable fermentation, so step-by-step series. I'm still releasing that and working on that on YouTube. If there's any post-production editors out there who want to help me with video production, please get in touch at dan@returntonature.us. But basically, on my website, I have an article about how to ferment with vegetables step by step, and it's very simple. The real issue is that anything, my tea prop, anything above the water line when you're fermenting vegetables is going to rot. So what I do is I used tapered jars. And if you use a tapered jar and you save the outer leaves of cabbage, the real thick ones, and you smash up your vegetables, make them salty, put them to about right here, and then you take those outer cabbage leaves and you shove them systematically into this lip so that everything is covered over. Then you'll pour a little bit more salty water on top of that, and that will help you to seal the vegetables in. What happens so often is that people will fill the vegetables up too high, right? As I mentioned, to there is pretty good. They'll fill the vegetables up too high, and then everything will just float to the top. If a vegetable or a seed or anything is floating to the top, you're going to get a lot of mold. This also can be avoided if you go up to it every day and you look, so you'll actually not have a lid on, right? You'll go up to it and you'll look and you'll make sure that nothing is floating above, and if it does, just pick it off. Also, if you're looking every day or two, if there is a little bit of mold on there, you can totally scrape it off. It's not a problem. It only becomes gross when it's a whole ton because you made a ferment and forgot about it for a couple weeks. So if you do that, you should have really no problem. I love the cabbage leaves. I think it works so easily. People get all complicated with it. How much salt? Some salt. That's it. Enough to where if you are gargling, it tastes salty. And otherwise, it's so simple to make your own fermented vegetables at home. And it's a great way to preserve. That gets you off of electricity and off of the refrigerator. So, roots and the second spring. So now what we're in is kind of the second spring. Before the winter hits hard, we get this phase where all the spring plants start to grow new leaves. So we're looking at dandelions, chicory, all these kind of edible greens are really profound to eat right now. Plantain, plantago, has very small leaves right now. Chicory is coming into its beginning stages. So those are all known as the second spring, and all of that is really good to start tonifying, helping the immune function, sautéing, putting in soups and stews, or harvesting and drying for your apothecary, right? So it's very important. The other aspect of that is roots. So now is the time for digging roots. So burdock roots are perfect right now. Dandelion roots are wonderful. One of the things you can do, even with those two, is after you harvest and you give your thanks and you do all your good harvesting ethical interaction, you can actually take those roots and chop them up into smaller pieces and put them in a vinegar prop again. So you'll take those and you'll put them in, say, apple cider vinegar, and you'll put a lid on that, and you can shake it for a couple days to a week or to 2 weeks. And what you'll then have is that vinegar. What we know about vinegar is very good at extracting minerals, right? And also alkaloids. So the bitterness comes out, right? So you'll have that infused vinegar with a lot of the minerals of dandelions and burdock, which is a large reason why you want burdock and dandelions. So really good little thing is make yourself some infused vinegars. You can do that also with leaves. You can do that with all kinds of things. Then you strain that and you take a few teaspoons of that before dinner, before eating, and that would give you the digestive bitter tonic that you probably could find in the store. So Jacob, brother Jacob, from the first year of mentorship, herbal mentorship that I offer, he is asking about mushroom double extracts, which is a really interesting split in the world. Medicinal mushrooms are becoming extremely popular. They're amazing. They're so helpful in cases of cancer and all kinds of stuff like that. But the problem is the products out there are so expensive that it's almost impossible to maintain a dose that would be required for something like cancer. So I'm making a lot of my own from a lot of wild-crafted mushrooms, and also with that there are several methods that people make them. So one should be mindful. So without explaining how to make a tincture, I'll skip over that process and you can figure that out. Very easy. As I mentioned, there's also Richo Check's book, Making Plant Medicine, that really breaks down a lot of the herbal medicine making techniques as well as tinctures. So a tincture is generally not a double extract. A double extract is kind of like a tincture and a tea combined. So there's this debate about something called polysaccharides in the mushroom world, and these are basically complex sugar molecules which seem to destroy the cancer. So there's debate whether polysaccharides are ruined by alcohol. And so there's a back and forth between, well, do you make the tea, the water extract first, or the alcohol extract first? The thing also I'm seeing a lot is that people will think that when you have a cold or a flu, taking reishi is what they do. And that's not really the application of something like an immunomodulating mushroom. Those need to be taken for 2 weeks to 2 years. Okay, this is a long, slow process of nurturing and healing immune function. Not boosting immune function, modulating immune function. So we're kind of on immunomodulators and adaptogens and these kind of things. The medicinal mushrooms are slow acting. Think about their growth, right? Slow acting, really deep nourishing. So we're talking about chaga, reishi, turkey tail, maitake, all these mushrooms that really have a very potent healing action. If you want to see more about that, Paul Stamets has a book called Mycomedicinals. Amazing research in Japan and China about cancer healing with these medicinal mushrooms, most of which grow in your backyard. So with those, you can either make a tea first, a decoction actually, which means that you reduce it like a stew. So you'd take chaga and you'd powder it, and then you'd cook it. And you'd cook it maybe for 2 to 4 hours, right? Some people do overnight in a crock pot. So you can make a kind of thicker gravy, right? That reduces the concentration and it makes it more potentized. The mushrooms seem to need that kind of potentization. Otherwise, if you take reishi from the forest and you pour hot water over it and you drink that, it's not really going to be very potent. If you make a decoction of that, it's going to be very potent and really helpful. But again, how much reishi can you possibly pull from the forest and how much can you take every day? So we have a supply and demand issue with the medicinal mushrooms. This is why I recommend more people grow medicinal mushrooms and be careful, especially with things like chaga. As chaga gets popular, it's very easy to rip out all the chaga of New Hampshire, and mycologists don't even really know the growth cycle of chaga and how long it even takes to reestablish, not to mention how long it takes that ecosystem to establish itself to even harbor something like chaga. So Jacob is saying, there's this water-soluble immune supporting issue that gets destroyed and rendered insoluble by alcohol. So you look at recipes, and I've seen it. Basically, some half of the world says reduce to a decoction and then add the alcohol after that. Now the only problem with that is then it's done, and I don't think that's a very proper tincture because they leave the alcohol overnight and then strain. I'm not really a big fan of that, so when I've done that, I've reduced and then half decoction, and then I've actually tinctured for another 2 months, right? So that's one way of doing it. The other side is that people do an alcohol extract first, and they say, oh, whatever, the polysaccharides will be fine, and then you take that, once you strain the mushroom out, and you will then add some water. Generally, I'm dealing with 100% alcohol, becomes 50% alcohol with water, right? So you add that, and then you'll simmer that down. And so now you have kind of an alcoholic mushroom water that you decoct, and then you add that separation and combination. This is the alchemical spagyric. So then you would add that into your ratio. Ratios is a whole nother level, which you'll have to come to class for. But that's basically the two ways of doing a medicinal mushroom extract. I would say anything is better than nothing, but if you want to make the decoction, it's very important, if you want to make the decoction first, it's very important to then consider how long you're going to actually steep the mushroom in alcohol for. So, you know, back and forth, that's the kind of stuff you get in these worlds. Mixing the tincture, he says, mixing the tincture and tea. The next morning I looked at my medicine and found it had turned to jello. So what is it, Jacob? I don't know what turned to jello. The tea was a touch warm when mixed with the alcohol, and I had gone pretty heavy in shroom to liquid ratio. Probably, if I know you, you made it really, really strong. Generally, a little bit about tincture making is you want to have a 50-50 alcohol ratio is generally good for everything except for resins, and then you want to have 1 to 2 for dry fresh herb, and 1 to 4 for dried herb. I think that's right, and I might be backwards, but that's why you should buy those books. So a couple notes that I wanted to just mention are we started a dream coven, which is definitely group dreaming. We're going to get into a lot of kind of dreaming rituals, talk about dreaming herbs, do a lot of dream sharing. So I have a Facebook group called Tales from the Dream Time, which you're all welcome to join. Tales from the Dream Dimension is what it's called. And we also started on Instagram hashtagging the tag Dream Coven. So my Instagram account is Return to Nature, so feel free to join that. I also started another Facebook group called Plant Medicine Mandala Magic. So the idea is to go into the ecosystem and start working with either fallen branches, leaves, stones, shells, whatever you find, and to make mandalas, make geometrical diagrams on the path, in the middle of the woods, in the middle of concrete, in a parking lot. Just start really bringing these beautiful nature mandalas into the consciousness of humans, and I feel like it could really bring the art of nature and the sacredness of nature in a non-dogmatic way to a lot of people who would stop and say, wow, that's pretty profound. So I see a lot of activism of making plant mandalas. When in that group, we have about 150 members now, and it's just blasted with beautiful, beautiful colors and leaves, so check that out. We also are planning a global water blessing ritual for the spring equinox, so stay tuned for that. That's going to be an alignment for people to do whatever ritual or ceremony or prayer or intentionality or gathering. You could have a potluck, just with all of us in sync doing some sort of ritual. So I'll be posting more on that on Facebook. Ananda Ashram workshop video, so if anybody wants to check that out, I did a weekend retreat at Ananda Ashram where we explored a lot of foraging, herbalism, magic, medicine making, all kinds of things. That's on my YouTube channel. Again, it's called Return to Nature Skills, and that's the first part is up there. Then next week, November 1st, is our Farm and Forage Fest. I think this is the 5th one we did at Cooperative 518 Farm. My good friends who are farming their hearts out. And we're going to do plant walks and farm tours and nature play. Chris Moran does nature play. Lauren is going to be there, a good friend, doing yoga classes. So y'all can check that out as well. That's on my website, on the calendar, as well as we have a Facebook event. Too many internet accounts, Facebook, Instagram, this and that. I'm also planning the next year's Foraging Herbalist Mentorship in 2016. This will be the 3rd year, so we're really excited to do that. We're going to change it up, and instead of doing all year, I'm going to do 4 weekends. And probably we're going to do this at Ananda Ashram in Monroe, New York. So it's going to be spring, summer, fall, and winter. So it'll be a weekend in spring, a weekend in summer, a weekend in fall, a weekend in winter. And so it will help you go through all the stages of foraging and herbalism and understand the plants from a longer and seasonal perspective, to understand, okay, well, this is a young mugwort plant and it's not time to harvest it yet, but I'll remember this spot and I'll get to watch it and basically learn how to identify everything when it's in its most potent situation. I'm probably going to do, now that this is the year 3, I'm going to do some sort of advanced training, advanced herbal training, incorporating more practical medicine making skills, foraging skills, survival skills, things like that. So stay tuned for that as well. I'll also be doing a lot more weekend retreats, such as I did at Ananda Ashram, and I'll probably be headed west for the winter, so going out to Southern California and going to do some classes out there. So if you're in the area, please spread the word and send me an email if you'd like to collaborate or know of any centers or places that would like to host some workshops. You can also check out lots of foraging and herbalism videos and articles and upcoming class schedule at my website, which is returntonature.us. Also, if you found this interesting and would like me to keep doing this, please feel free to donate anything. You can do that by PayPal at dan@returntonature.us. So that just helps cover all the costs of trying to make internet in this world. So thank you all for listening, and I wish you all many plant blessings, and please work with the plants as deeply as you can, honor them, and ask them for guidance. Thank you all, and have a beautiful night. Namaste.